God has given every person, doesn't matter if they even follow him or not, God has given every person a certain set of natural skills, skill sets, gifts, and abilities. Man, this kid is super musical. This kid is super creative. This kid is just a born athlete. Look at how this one writes, you know? He's given everybody specific skills and set of skills. Public education, you unlearn that. I want to really caution everybody, the way that you speak about educators, public educators, and the way that you approach them, even the way that you view them. Not all of them are trying to put condoms on bananas and get them to go and do pronoun things. And not all of them are trying to force them to, have an altar call. I got so sick of the culture wars. And the left and the right, you're drawn and quartered between the left and the right. And I was just there trying to do my damn job.
Yes.
I was there trying to give life to kids, to teach them how to read, to teach them how to speak, to teach them how to be humans. And so the left was always saying like, oh, look at all these, Bible thumping teachers trying to do this. And then it was much worse on the right. I heard it much worse on the right. Oh, look at all these public educators are trying to teach them to put condoms on bananas, and they're trying to get them to believe that in evolution and all this stuff. I mean, and this is those who have been in Protestant churches. How many times have you heard your pastor rail against public education and public educators? Before I became Orthodox, I heard that so many times. I looked around like, well, I can see 12 people right now that are public educators. What are they thinking right now? Because he basically just crapped on us from the pulpit.
Oh, look at this guy. Hello there. How are you doing, brother?
Good. Can you hear me all right?
I can hear you. good. Manny, can you hear him good?
I can. Yeah.
Awesome. Sweet. Manny may be jumping off at some point. So whenever you got to go, Manny, you got to do your thing. I think I've got this covered. Joe and we got this. All right. Joseph, welcome to the show. This is the very first time that you've been on camera with us, and I'm excited to have a conversation with you, brother. How are you, sir?
I'm great. How are you doing?
Pretty good. Welcome. So how do you feel? Very first time.
Good. Yeah. Like I told you privately, you asked if I was nervous to do an interview, and I said, anyone who's stared down a group of 7th and 8th graders at 7:40 on a Monday morning, you're not nervous about anything after doing that for some years. So yeah.
Well, I bet
I've been hazed.
That's very true. I think we're going to get into some of that, are we?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Awesome. Well, so for everyone that's tuning in right now, this is this is the Study of Stuff podcast. It's our very first live streaming interview, and we're going to be talking about education. And Joseph is a former educator. He has a lot of experience in a lot of different areas in education, from what I've been told. So Joseph, I'd like to start off at the beginning, because most of our early development as human beings has a lot to do with how we kind of look at the world, how we deal with the world, and how we end up, like our final, chapter in life. Not that you are in the final chapters, but I mean,
I'll be 50 this year, man. So I'm like, it's all downhill.
Nah, man. I think you start life at 40. So we're like 10. We're like 10.
I guess I'm 90 then.
So basically, start us off with like who you are, where you came from, what was your family life like, and how does education fit into that in terms of your education and your interest in becoming an educator?
Wow. Okay. Is my volume okay?
Yeah, it's great.
Okay.
Sounds good on my end.
So I think that's like, there's a lot of like streams that kind of converge at one point, one being kind of, in terms of the family, the faith journey to orthodoxy, because I'm still a catechumen. I'm very new. I just became a catechumen just months ago, right before Pascha. So I guess the place where my own personal experience converges to me being an educator was my dad was a Baptist pastor for 53 years before he passed away a few years ago. And I was raised in Georgia. in like small town. In fact, my town that I'm raised at is the same place, I believe, that Josh Scogan from the Chariot 68. It's like, which is weird because the town is like the most uneventful nothing anywhere, even still. But very, very small town, small Georgia town, very Southern, especially, like I said, I'm almost 50, so I was born in 74. And so I remember lots dealing with race riots, a lot of racial issues, stuff coming up in the 70s and the 80s and such. So it was a uniquely Southern upbringing. At the same time, being a kid of a Baptist pastor had a lot to do with me forming pretty much everything. I mean, that's like the most formative, your most formative years, the impressing years, those first 5 years specifically. Well, in terms of education, my own experience was both private school and public school. As a parent, we have sent our kids to private school, public school, and homeschooled as well. My youngest one just graduated with his homeschool degree. My oldest son graduated from like a private Christian school, and then they all went to public school. So I've got, from the parent angle, the flavor of all three, the challenges of all three, and from the personal experience, at private Christian school, like Protestant school, and then public school as well. I actually graduated from a public school in St. Cloud High School in Florida, outside of the Orlando area. But how did it converge to me wanting to be a teacher? I actually didn't teach until I was 30. So I taught for 18 years from the time I was 30 up until 2022 is when I pulled out of teaching to start the coffee shop, the coffee roastery, and the cafe, the coffee shop, which is probably another story that we'd like to get into. But as far as, that time frame, there was a lot. And my dad was, we could disagree a lot now. I think even then we disagreed a lot on like theological stuff, but he was a very passionate lover of the scripture. He also was a lover of history and books. And so when he passed away, he was working on his third doctorate degree at that point.
Wow.
He was definitely kind of an academic, and all the men who've had a significant impact on my life were all academics in some way. It was not like sports stars or musicians. It was usually people who were like, leaders, like religious leaders, or people who were thinking about kind of the larger existential questions of life. So he really set me up on that. So it's no coincidence when I became a teacher, specifically in the high school area, that I was doing history and literature were the two fields that I went into. So,
And your dad, what did he focus on for his doctorates?
It was all biblical study stuff. I mean, as with any doctorate degree, you get like really, really specific about a narrow point. I think his most recent dissertation was over the book of Ephesians or something. I'm not quite sure kind of what focus he took. He was a lot more in terms of like the pastoral care kind of stuff, like taking care of people. He was kind of like everybody's dad, like always. He was a lot less about like beating everyone over the head with theology and more about like making sure that the people in his congregation were taken care of. So, yeah.
That's definitely a good approach, something that we should all start considering a little bit more in general. But to get back on the subject of education, it sounds like you have a very wide experience yourself personally, also your family in general, and from your kids to the older people in your family. Seems like you have a really good understanding of what works and what doesn't work. In terms of like how your experience as a teacher, how did a lot of what you learned from your parents, from your older family members, how did that influence you as a teacher? And how did you apply a lot of that how you were as a teacher?
That's a good question. That's a really good question. I taught over the course of those 18 years, I taught in 4 completely different kind of contexts. So let me kind of give a brief overview of that.
Yes.
And then we'll probably come back to like delve into those a little bit if you want. But for the first 5.5 years, I was teaching inner city middle school in Omaha, Nebraska. It was a very rough neighborhood I was in. That was middle school, first 5.5 years. And then after that was when I took a job with the DOD, and we went in January of 2011 to Turkey. And so we lived in Turkey for 5.5 years. It was a very odd assignment because I was teaching American curriculum to American kids on a Turkish military base in Turkey. But it was still an American curriculum. So the cultural overlays with what was happening educationally was really, really, really interesting. There's a lot to unpack there. A whole nother long story was basically ISIS booted us off out of that area of town or out of that country. This was in 2016. And if you recall how ISIS had become a threat, a whole bunch of other stories. I think it was a lot more maybe of a perceived threat than a real threat, but I wasn't, it was higher than my pay grade to know really what was going on. But nonetheless, we had to leave. And so we had 48 hours to make a decision. And we had been toying with the idea of like going where we were going to go. We didn't really want to go back to Nebraska, and we kind of threw a dart at the map and went to Boise, Idaho. And so we were there for 2 years. Unfortunately, it didn't last long because the cost of living was really high, and the teacher pay was one of the worst in the U.S. And while I was there, I got a job at a private IB school. So the International Baccalaureate is kind of like a level above like AP classes. It's kind of like an all-encompassing curriculum. The stuff they were doing was more like you would do like middle college level kind of stuff. So I taught global politics, Asian history, went real deep in more on the humanities side there during that time. And then 2 years, it just wasn't happening. My dad was having health problems, and we eventually, for multiple reasons, push and pull factors, decided to blanketed my resume all over this part of Tennessee, and eventually got this job here in Maryville, Tennessee, which is right outside of Knoxville. And so I was there for 4 years. And during that time was also straddled the COVID years, I don't know if I'm supposed to say that word around, but like the 2020, it was right in the middle. And so that was a little bit.
What type of school was that?
What's that?
Sorry to interrupt you. What type of school was that?
That was a public school. So I was public school the whole time, with the exception of those 2 years in Boise.
Okay. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Keep going.
So that was a brief overview of my teaching career. That was 18 years in total. It spanned middle school, high school, English and history, public school, private school. It was kind of wide and varied throughout the course of that time. So to your question, was an interesting question, though, like what happened in my family that led me to be successful in that? And that touches on a lot of things. So like, I think the main thing that my family experienced, specifically watching my parents and how they dealt with people. So a little bit of my own story is we were basically run out of town about every 3 years. He's a Baptist pastor. Things happen quite frequently in terms of specifically like these independent churches seem to like, there's always a fight, conflict, and something happens and it splits, or someone has to go. And it was always the same thing. There would be a church that was in need, and he would come in, he'd fix it. Within a year or two, it'd split, and then we'd get run out of town on a rail. And that happened about every 3 years on average. Now, with that in the context of understanding how he would deal with people, I would see, and him and my mom both, the way that they dealt with the people who were kind of these avaricious, black teeth or black sheep with sharp teeth coming in with their own agendas to control things. And seeing how they dealt with the people who were being just so inappropriate, but also how they were dealing with the people who were just hurt people. And so a lot of it had to do with like witnessing how they interacted with people and how forgiving and gracious they were in every context and every situation. I mean, they navigated all of those situations much better than I ever could have. And so in the context of that, when I was dealing with people, specifically kids, in class, it was like I never got ruffled by people acting crazy or by guys being aggressive or fights in the hallway or whatever. None of that stuff ever bothered me because I had seen beyond the surface, being raised in that. I saw like all of this stuff that's going on. And one thing I learned too in the process is that behavior reflects need,
Yep.
Behavior reflects need. The way that people act is reflecting what's going on inside of them, right? So when somebody's acting like attention-seeking behavior, or acting violent, or acting aggressive, or acting differently than they had before, it's reflecting a need. Either their needs are getting met, and their behavior reflects a healthy intrapersonal experience with themselves, or their behavior reflects all kind of problems going on. And I was doing like middle schoolers, like inner city middle schoolers and high schoolers. And not only do you got just the standard stuff of the developmental stuff, right? All these hormones going on, all this social interaction going on. None of that stuff. They don't teach you any of that stuff in education school. They don't teach you how to be a person, how to be a leader, how to be a good person in the context of these other people who are already struggling. Even if they have a great home life, they got, hormonal stuff going on, developmental stuff going on. And you layer that with specifically like inner city stuff where kids are dealing with, dad's gone, mom's strung out. I haven't seen my family for a long time. I mean, I had one kid, he was arrested for shooting and killing a kid in his own bed. He was 12 years old.
He shot and killed?
He shot and killed another kid in his own bed. And I had him and I had his brother and a whole bunch of them in class. And that was a more extreme story, but it was always stuff like that. A kid shows up acting crazy and you find out later, like, oh, well, she's pregnant. Oh, she's in 8th grade. Well, yeah, her life just changed. So what's she going to do on this standardized test?
Yep.
So there's all these layers and all of this BS that they don't consider when these legislators are making these laws about what, who should do what and how things should perform and how people should perform. And then you're going to punish teachers because they're not doing this or that, not getting these numbers. One of the whole problems with education is it tries to quantify the qualifiable.
Yeah. Yes.
It quantifies the qualifiable. Everything has to show up on a spreadsheet. Everything has to show up on some metric that somehow can be weighed. Put it on a scale.
Yep.
But you can't weigh that stuff. You can't weigh for 18 years every single day that a kid came to my classroom. The first thing I would do, I would shake their hand. And people thought that was weird, but I did it all the time for 18 years. That was my thing. Kids I didn't even know would come to my classroom just to shake my hand because I would give them a firm, strong handshake and I look them in the eye and say, hey, so-and-so, how are you doing? And if I didn't even know them, they always knew they could get a respectful greeting. People don't even get that. How do you quantify that? Mm-hmm. How do you put that on a spreadsheet? You can't.
Yeah. No.
So how do you put that how do you qualify, the fact that here's a person who sincerely cares about this kid and they're trying to actually just give life to them and give them some hope and give them some skills for life. You can't quantify any of that stuff. And so the problem with the industrial model is it quantifies the qualifiable and you can't.
Yeah, it's interesting because you as a teacher are identifying exactly because you're in the machine. You were in the machine. You were describing exactly a lot of the stuff that Synaxis podcast was describing it, how they tried to model and social engineer the entire thing to create this industrial factory production thing where it breaks down the soul. And exactly what you just said. I love that thing where we said behavior reflects. Go into that again. Sorry, what was that?
Behavior reflects need.
That is such a great statement. That's definitely going to be in the show notes. That's awesome. That's so true because you're not trained as a teacher to identify those things. You're not trained to even know how to deal with them. And the very fact that you took the time out to shake their hands is a huge thing. Someone might think of that as such a small little behavior, but it's massive. And good on you, brother. That's a great thing to do. Like that probably impacted kids' lives to this day. They probably remember that guy. I don't remember his name, but I remember he would shake my hand. You know what I mean? For sure.
Well, going back to the question you originally asked, I think it's probably no coincidence that, at the end of church, my dad and my mom would shake everyone's hand as they left.
Yeah.
And it was community, that's what it was. One thing I would add too, is that in addition to the experience that I had, the positive experience I had with my family, seeing how they dealt with people and kind of translating that over to the classroom, and other people outside of my own family, other people who impacted me positively, I used that to help me in the classroom. But some of it was in the negative side was the experience that I had in school, in all schools, but in public school too. And I was kind of that kid that, just got into so much trouble. I was a wallflower on one hand, but I was like getting kicked out for all manner of stuff, suspended, all kind of stuff. I was just in trouble a lot. I was a problem kid. I was a preacher's kid, but I was also trying to prove to the world that I didn't, I was just living with my finger up to everybody. I didn't want anything or anyone to tell me otherwise. And public school, even then, was completely irrelevant to me. And so I had such a bad experience in education that when I just had a chip on my shoulder, so that when I got into the classroom, the kids who were like me, who were the troublemakers, who were disengaged, who were the wallflowers, who didn't care, the angry kids were easy. The apathetic kids were really hard.
Yes.
But nonetheless, none of that stuff bothered me, And so to like laugh it off, to kind of joke, and more than anything, to treat them like humans. You treat them well and they will treat you well back. And I never had anyone who was a problem person that I treated them well and they gave me something negative back. I had very little problem with kids. I had very little problem with parents. You treat people well with dignity and that'll come back,
Yeah, it sounds like a lot of your upbringing reflected a lot of that attitude that you have there. Everything that you just described, and your parents and all of that stuff, and bouncing around and trying to focus on rather than theology, you focus on your practice, a praxis, as we would say, as Orthodox. It shows even the way you've modeled yourself as a teacher, and also understanding the position that that kid, that trouble kid, you being a rebellious kid yourself. I know because my education situation was horrible. It was pretty rough, like super, super rough. So this subject to me is very personal. Like I hated school for a lot of reasons. Wasn't treated well on a lot of levels. So I totally can understand everything you've said. And going back to the quantifying thing, that was a big thing for me. They would always do these weird tests on me. They couldn't figure out a lot of stuff about me. I remember I had a teacher once call in like a therapist, and they sat me down, and the conclusion he's, and I'm not a genius, but he did say this. He goes, either he's crazy, like he used the word crazy, or there's something wrong with him. He said he's crazy, or there's something wrong with him, or he's a genius. And then my dad, I have a great dad. He walked in, he goes, how about he's bored? How about you just bore him? That's probably the problem. You know what I mean? So I can definitely vouch for having the need for teachers like you back in those days, for sure. Because I'm a little younger than you, but I know the school system was identical to what you described in Canada. It was pretty ridiculous. So out of the different school systems, because you've mentioned quite a few, from military school to inner city school, and then you said even your family's had a Christian school experience, yourself as well. How would you describe all of these types of schools from your experience, and how do you view the system affecting them? I don't know if you know what I mean by that question, because like the system will try to affect every level of schooling, even homeschooling. They try to involve themselves. I know it's like that in Canada. I know it's like that in the US. How did you see involvement in the inner city school, private school, military school, Christian school, and how did you navigate those troubled waters?
That's a really good question. Wow. I think to really be able to fully answer the question, I think we got to go a little bit into the DNA of public education, because I would argue that education itself is just such a Frankenstein. The institutional education is just an aberration of parts shocked together. Genetically is dysfunctional. And my argument is that we don't need to refine or revise it. We need to completely burn the whole thing down and start over with an innovative new idea, with a prophetic imagination, with a completely set of questions that we ask that then bases the foundation of the thing itself. So without going too deep into the history of it, essentially education as we know it, and when I talk about the corrupted genes of it, it is as such because it's been a history of reactions, a history of responses. It's never been like a long-term vision of how things could go or how things should function. Let's develop an infrastructure that fits for the users. It's always been responsive and reactionary, right? So let me explain. Like, here's a tale of two cities that I've lived in, right? If anyone's driven in Atlanta, it's the freaking worst place. The only place I've driven that's worse than Atlanta is Istanbul. And at least that it's so bizarre that it's at least entertaining. Atlanta is just maddening. Yet the interstate is like 5 lanes wide. Why is that, right? How can they have so many interstates and it's always 2 a.m. it's going to be congested? Well, essentially what's happened is in 1996, the Olympics were going to go there. Oh, we got to expand the interstate. So they expanded it with no thought as to like the off ramps and how it was going to go in the points of transition. how it would interstate from the transition to how it transition from interstate to other interstates or highways, and it just always causes a bottleneck. Go through Atlanta and watch. That's what's causing the problem. It's not accidents, and it's not even too many cars. It's those off ramps. And the point of that is that they did not plan for the future. They responded to immediate need. I also lived in Omaha for a long time, and I was there in the 90s through the early 2000s, the only place I've really lived for very long. And in the late 90s, they started this huge movement of changing the traffic patterns and the interstates, and everyone was like, this is wasted tax money. I remember reading in the newspaper, they were saying how they're making it with a 50-year plan. So they got with civil engineers, drew out projections, made 50-year plans and all that. It ended up being, it made sense. And when they were done with it, now Omaha's huge, like the population has boomed since then, and they've missed no beat. So they've not reacted, they planned accordingly. And so which of these two, is it Atlanta traffic or Omaha traffic? The public education system is definitely like the Atlanta traffic of reactionary responses, right?
Yep.
So I know last time we talked, you guys talked a lot about like kind of at the meta level, what's been going on and oppressing in terms of like education. But at the genetic level, what was even going on socially was that it was reacting to social pressures, a lot of times reacting to political situations and political issues. So if you think about how the child labor law, this is like really the whole key component when things flipped, right? This was the trigger point. And this was in 1938. The Fair Labor and Standards Act was passed in 1938, which immediately not only made child labor illegal, it defined it. It also had other labor laws to it, but immediately it made child labor illegal. Now, prior to this, now it's not just about child labor; it's also about a huge issue, which is federal agency, right? Like who has the power to do so? Prior to this, there had been a decade, 60 years, especially from 1880 to 1920, huge movements to change the problem of kids in factories, right? If you're familiar with Mother Jones, that name, she was an actual person. She was always going around like parading kids who had maimed feet and hands and fingers cut off and stuff like that to prove the point that kids should not be in factories. So, but they were at the state level. Right. So in America, we have the 10th Amendment, which states that any power is not delegated to the federal government or delegated to the states. Nowhere else in the Constitution or the other 9 amendments does it discuss anything about education. It's always been left to the states up until this point. So it wasn't even that they made child labor illegal. And then by extension, they had to coerce them to school because everyone knew if you tell a kid they can't go to the factory, but they don't have to go to school, well, then what's going to happen? They're just going to have a bunch of roustabout kids doing nothing. Well, suddenly the kids had to have somewhere to go, right? So it automatically outlawed kids working, which I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but it was just a knee-jerk reaction. And also, as a side, this was in the context of FDR, the New Deal, executive orders, all of that stuff wrapped up in something that was really unconstitutional because it was all on the premise of executive orders done in an emergency situation.
Sorry to stop you right there for 1 second, because it's funny because that leads into my presentation next week about the birth as a teenager. Everything you just mentioned is how they formulated and created the whole version of a teenager. Keep going. You're on a roll, brother. Go. Yeah.
So we could go so deep into FDR and the New Deal and all this stuff that I would argue it wasn't even about dams and schools and parks being built. It was about the shift from the states to the federal. And he proposed that he was going to solve the crisis of the Great Depression. And what solved it? Us going into World War II. He like put a Band-Aid on a bleeding, gashing, gaping wound, but it wasn't until World War II. So that's a whole other thing. I mean, war and religious holidays are the best things for bad economies, So anyway, so 1938, this happens. It switches to children can't go in the factories or can't work in factories or mines or do any kind of work like that outside of the home. They had to suddenly go into school. The big flip was that it was no longer a state issue. It was now a federal issue. And this is where it begins the watershed of federal mandates. So now who's in charge? It's not the people locally. It's not the people within the region, it's the federal. And if you look at the structure of the funding structure, still the largest piece of the pie comes to the federal government of any given public school in America. So that was really one of the biggest, the linchpins was the whole child labor thing, the taking of power away from the states. And then what they had to do, and here's the thing, this is what answers your question. So then what did they do? All that people knew at that point had been decades of factory life. So when they created the school, not only did they have to create something that would be efficient, they had to react to suddenly all these kids are out here. I mean, people have been educating their kids for centuries prior to this. However, suddenly it was a new game. And so they had to ask new questions, and their response was not appropriate to the need in the long term, right? They built a 1996 Atlanta interstate system, but they didn't think 50, 100 years down the line. So what did they do? They basically mimicked the factories, right? Yes. In the factory, you work in lines, you work on assembly lines, the bell rings and you go to lunch, the bell rings and you come back, and then the bell rings again and then you go home, you come back Monday to Friday between the hours of like 8 and 4. You do the same thing every day. Back then, actually, it wasn't until the Depression that you actually got 2 days off. It was usually 6-day work week. So then they came back, and it was just the same thing over and over again. You work in rows. You have a floor manager, a teacher. You've got the clock at the front. And then you have to prove your worth by how many widgets you make or how many whatever it is that you're producing. Well, what are kids going to produce? Oh, we got to somehow produce something. Well, that's where they started to have to quantify what they were actually learning. Yes. And different people would answer the question differently in terms of like, well, what is the point of education? I mean, depending on who you talk to, you get a different response. Well, how can you build anything without having a consistent across the board, even a vision? You didn't know why they were doing it. It was like, okay, so the kids are out of factories now. Now what? It was a response, a reaction. Mm-hmm. And so to answer your question about private schools and such, unfortunately, what I've seen is and this from my own experience and even from the experience of my kids, who's even recently, my oldest one graduated from a private Christian school in 2021. And it was the same thing then. The same thing that it was, when I was there, which is it basically just takes the same factory model and then brings it there's no public funding. So it puts the pressure on the parents to pay for it. And then it's like, now you got the factory model, and then they cram the Bible, So it's like, what better way to make somebody hate the thing that is the most valuable thing than to tell them they've got to do it?
Very true.
I mean, seriously, you go to these you would go to and I would have to go to these too. It's Bible classes, and nobody gives a rat's ass about what anyone's saying. There's maybe one or two kids who sincerely care, but how can you make something that is so valuable into something so pedestrian? It's forcing it upon people. Yeah. Not only do you see that in terms of like Bible in school at large, public education could or should be, or any education could be something that has some social merit, some value. It could do something besides just make people into drone workers, cubicle workers. But you force it, you coerce it. How are you going to make somebody hate the thing that is valuable? Make them do it against their will. Yep. Yep. So when we see, I think the conversation about homeschool is kind of a whole separate little piece.
We're going there.
Yeah, the conversation about private school. I would love to have a conversation. I'd love to interview Father Turbo on this, as I know that they're doing it within their school system there, or within his private school there. I'm so new to Orthodoxy that I don't know what an Orthodox Christian school would look like. I really, really hope that they not go the same route as the Protestant schools of basically just like, well, what are the public schools doing? Then you do those things and then you model it. I mean, what I've seen is the pedagogy in Christian schools is so much worse. And this goes across multiple states, multiple decades. I'm not saying that there's some out there who don't do it well. I've seen some in the Catholic realm, some of the Jesuit schools that do a more classical education and probably prepare them better. I'm trying not to make blanket statements, but from my own experience, it has been essentially taking the factory DNA and then just like, it's like the Frankenstein, and you slap a Bible in his hand and then he sends off to do more, more damage than good.
Yeah, it's a good way of describing it. I mean, it is what they were trying to do originally with the Rockefellers and such, is to create a system. It's interesting because you're identifying from the inside, from the DNA, as you said, and when you look at it from the outside, looking at inward, a lot of the teachers, principals, and heads of education aren't even aware that there is a reasoning behind it, that they were purposely structured the school system to create factory workers, cubicle workers, and drones. It's systematically created in that way. And then I guess when it came to like Protestant schools and this and that, either they didn't know how else to build a system and they just said, okay, well, this kind of looks like it works. This is just apply the Bible to it, exactly like you said. In terms of Orthodox schools, I think, and if anyone knows otherwise, like correct me, but I think they're a little bit not disorganized, but they don't have a unified way of doing it as of yet. I know in Canada, in Toronto, where I'm from, they had started Orthodox schools a couple years back, well, decades back, and they were just trying to kind of piece together a curriculum. They didn't really have anything to go on, but I know a couple of the people that were trying to organize these schools personally. I know them, and that was one of their concerns. They didn't want to make it feel like, Sunday school, like you had to be forced to go to this thing. You had to, exactly what you described, because like what better way to make someone hate the thing that they should love the most, but then to force them to sit down and do it, right? Mm-hmm. But at the same time, as parents, as educators and all that stuff, it is quite the task and the duty. Like, how do you solve this issue where you have children that aren't going to want to eat broccoli? How do you get them to eat broccoli? You know what I mean? Like, how do you do that without making them hate it? You know what I mean? And at the same time, you don't want to wrap it in sugar or like cheese to be like, here, just eat this broccoli. Just trust me, it's good for you. So like, in all of these models or your experience or any way that you see it, how do you see a solution to some of these problems?
Well, you get them to raise the broccoli. You get them to grow the broccoli.
Yeah.
You don't do the work for them you don't do the work for them or buy it off of a factory shelf at your local grocery store. You put them in the dirt and they get dirty. They get grounded. They get, from the beginning part of it, they are part of the growing of the broccoli. And then they pull that thing. And then the question isn't, do I like the flavor of this thing? The question is, or rather the statement would be, look at what I've helped make. Look at what I've helped grow. And then it's no longer even about the broccoli itself. It's about the process. It's about the relationship that was built. It was about the minerals you absorbed by putting your hands in the dirt. Mm-hmm. There's so much more to it. Your question is great because it's not even about broccoli. This is not even about education. Mm-hmm. This is about us living in these isolated little boxes, these isolated little cubes, and now in the last 20 years with the advent of cell phones, everything, I'm not trying to sound like a Luddite, but we've never become more divided than we are now. I'm not just talking religiously, politically. I'm talking like physically divided.
Yep.
Why did kids react when I would shake their hand? It may have been the only time that someone actually touched them in a good way that day. I don't know.
Yeah.
Why do people react when somebody like looks you in the eye and like sincerely asks you a question like how you're doing?
Yes.
We've become completely. We have become the product of that same factory system that we've been educated. We haven't been educated to be good workers. We haven't even been educated to be cubicle workers. We've been educated to be isolated members, right? Mm. As society, we're not even a Frankenstein. That would imply there's some kind of cohesion. We're like this big table of organs lying out, right? And people focus their identity on their distinctions, not their unity or where they belong in the context of a larger organism or something that even matters. People focus their identity on things that are so completely about like how they are such the minority of the minority of the minority that they have we've self-surgered ourselves. Mm-hmm. And so the bigger problem is not even education. I mean, the bigger problem is like we have so little community. We have so little health, physical and spiritual, emotional and everything. But we've been trained to be so by these things. And now that we've been trained to do so, we live our lives in these little pockets and these little boxes. that we scroll through or spend our time in the attention economy. And we have given ourselves to that. So how do you get kids to eat broccoli? You lead them in the garden and grow the broccoli with them. They will eat it.
Beautiful.
Because that's how God made us.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
That's the process.
I really love what you're saying. I love that you're part of our community. I really do. I love that. I'm not trying to derail it. I think you're on to it. I think this is exactly what we need, and this is exactly what is lacking. I also find that it's lacking online with the Orthodox community, the way it's kind of the direction it's taking. I'm not trying to change the subject. I think it's exactly the subject. I think you nailed it. You hit it. You hit it. Beautiful, brother. You said it so beautifully. And I see the same problem online. And I see that the same thing is happening. Instead of using it as a tool to bring us together, it's kind of making us further apart. A lot of the messages I'm personally getting about like a lot of the stuff that's happening online, they find what we're doing here refreshing. And what we are doing here, what I'm saying I mean we, like the chat, the way we all kind of come together, the way we discuss, the way we talk outside of the like the circle, like Manny told me you messaged him the other day asking him questions. I was like, beautiful. You know what I mean? Yeah. I'm getting messages from other people going, I got this guy and he, I found him. This is exactly what we need. So to bring it back to education, I think your idea of gardening and showing the children, the kids, even us, why we should be eating the broccoli and then growing the broccoli and then watching the process and experiencing it and shaking their hands. I think you're 100% correct. Looking someone in the eye, having a conversation like we're having right now, even though we're far apart, it can connect us. Because I know the day is going to come where I shake your hand. I know I'm going to walk right up to you, brother, and shake your hand and hug you. I know it's going to happen. And if we don't look at life that way, and we don't look at the gospel that way, the church that way, community that way, I think we're in trouble. And I think you've identified it really, really well.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
completely.
So I wanted you to go off in any direction you want to go, because I think there's a couple places you can go here, and I just want to give you the stage. Where do you want to go? Do you want to go further into homeschooling and orthodoxy? Do you want to go back into discussing some of the problem areas, some of the solutions? I've never done what I'm about to do with an interview. Usually I try to guide it, but you've opened so many good little paths. Oops, sorry. I want you to take whichever one you're moved to take.
Okay, so why don't I want to kind of piggyback on what we were just discussing and put some kind of something to hang the metaphor of the broccoli on, and go a little deeper than that, because it's abstract. What is actually okay? So what does that look like? You're telling the kids they write the curriculum. That's not really what I'm saying. What the core of any education system. I think even a publicly funded system could work if it did this thing, which is to ask a different set of questions. And the set of questions is based on a certain premise, which is this: God has given every person, doesn't matter if they even follow him or not, God has given every person a certain set of natural skills, skill sets, gifts, and abilities, right? I believe that firmly, and I believe that from like having, I don't even know how many thousands of students I had over the course of 18 years, and watching them all and realizing, man, this kid is super musical. This kid is super creative. This kid is just a born athlete. Look at how this one writes. There are certain things like, and those aren't because they come from families like that. In many cases, it was quite the opposite. I mean, if you meet my family members, I'm like complete lark. I'm unlike anybody else in my family, because God has gifted us with different types of things, right? Yeah. Of course, there's an element that you are a product of your environment to an extent, but we're all natured differently, right? Like, so we've got obviously the human nature that is just what's God has given every general one, but he's given everybody specific skills and a set of skills. And it's a matter, and the people that like are really, really blessed are the ones who discover what that is. Here's the problem, is that public education unteaches that, right? Yep. Public education, you unlearn that in public education, right? Can I read a poem?
Oh yeah, man, please.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Lit teacher, I'm going to read a poem. So this is from, can you still see me?
I can see you.
Okay. I pulled up another tab. I'm not sure how this works. Okay, so this is from a guy named Billy Collins. He is a contemporary poet. He was the poet laureate of America for a while. I think this was from 1989, so this is a modern poem. And it's called First Reader. And this really frames what I'm trying to say really, really well. So here's the poem. I can see them standing politely on the wide pages that I was still learning to turn. Jane in a blue jumper, Dick with his crayon brown hair, playing with a ball or exploring the cosmos of the backyard, unaware that they were the first characters, the boy and the girl who begin fiction. Beyond the simple illustration of their neighborhood, the other protagonists were waiting in a huddle. Frightened Heathcliff, frightened Pip, Nick Adams carrying a fishing rod, Emma Bovary riding into Rowan. But I would read about the perfect boy and his sister even before I would read about Adam and Eve, garden and gate. And before I heard the name Gutenberg, the type of their simple talk was moving into my focused eyes. It was always Saturday, and he and she were always pointing at something and shouting, "Look," pointing at the dog, the bicycle, or at their father as he pushed a hand mower over the lawn, waving at aproned mother framed in the kitchen doorway, pointing toward the sky, pointing at each other. And they wanted us to look, but we had looked already and seen the shaded lawn, the wagon, the postman. We had seen the dog, walked, watered, and fed the animal. And now it was time to discover the infinite clicking permutations of the alphabet's small and capital letters. Alphabetical ourselves in the rows of classroom desks, we were forgetting how to look and learning how to read. And so those last two lines are really wrap the whole thing up, within the frame of like, this is the first book that we all read in kindergarten. And at the very end, what is it about? We're now in alphabetical rows with our names, and we forget how to look. We forget how to learn. We forget how to love it. And now it's just focused on the quantifiable. So-and-so can read at this level, and then they quantify it to some deeper metric that really doesn't mean anything. It's the unlearning. So true. That's the problem. It's the unlearning. Yep. You look at kids going into a kindergarten classroom, and they're all like super excited to go in. They're excited to see their teacher, to meet their teacher. They love their friends. They're engaged. The same group of kids 13 years later going out of the senior class, they're throwing their hats and they're not happy because they had this great experience. They want to get the hell out. Yeah. I've taught seniors, and I can tell you they're the hardest ones to teach because they are so done because it's pointless. Yep. They've been untaught how to love anything of learning. The few of them that are the obedient ones have done the things, they've done all the things that they're expected to do, largely at the carrot on the stick of education, like furthered education or something. But that's probably a whole nother podcast in and of itself, like what quote unquote higher education is. We take them into these classroom settings and these factory settings, and none of them are perfectly unified little cogs and pieces and parts. They are like each unique in different ways in all the ways God made, but there's similarities. Some kids over here are very artistic. Some kids are very personable. Some just want to like make groups and games and stuff like that. But we unteach all of that from them. How many people out there right now would have been the next John Coltrane? Or how many people out there would have been the next, great religious leader? Or how many out there right now why do we not have very many authors right now, the next Flannery O'Connor? Why do we not have much of this anymore? Because they've been untaught how to be the person that God made them to be. So what does it look like when we, take them out and they grow the broccoli? It has to be something that looks like modeling it according to how they naturally are, right? Mm-hmm. So in school, we learned about the different multiple intelligences, right? So there are some kids that are kinesthetic learners, like they're the athletes. They're physical. They've got to do something like physical, moving around. There are spatial learners, which they learn largely in three-dimensional kind of things. If Cyprian's still in there, I'm sure he's probably one of these, learning in terms of dimensions and spatiality. There's some that are interpersonal. It doesn't matter what they're doing. They just want to be with people having fun. Right. Yep. So there's a layer of like personality types, a layer of learning styles that are often very closely related, and all of that gets homogenized within the system. Here's the thing. If you look at the percentage of people and their learning styles, there's one particular learning style, which is the verbal learner, the linguistic learner, which means that if you tell them something, they'll learn. Now, the last time I looked at studies, this is about 6 to 7% of the population. Mm-hmm. But 90+% of all the learning of all the curriculum, at least in America, that I ever experienced was geared for that. They just tell you a bunch of stuff, tell you a bunch of content, tell you a bunch of information with the false assumption and the false trope that knowledge is power, and then lead you on to give you just a bunch of random information. Thinking that you'll take some of this random information and do something with it at some point. But it's completely aberrant to the way that God's made us, right? So in the classroom and stuff, there has nothing to do with finding what different parts that God has made for these people and trying to, make that as such. They kind of aggregate it down so that by the end of it, at the end of 13 years, they come in all these different types and skill sets they leave not even knowing in many cases who or what they are. They're just this gray goo, this aggregated, it's much like the ground beef that we buy, right? You go buy ground beef, you don't get one cow, you get 1,000 cows aggregated somewhere in Kansas from some CAFO, which is and then ultimately it's not even healthy anymore. That's what we've got now in public education system. So how do we question? So rather than just rather than just a bitching session about how bad it is, we'd have to flip it around. And the answer is not, and this is what I would say to the homeschoolers, the answer is not to just do the opposite of what public schools are doing.
Exactly. That's what I wanted to
You can't just undo that thing. You can't just stop doing a sin. You've got to fill it with something good, right? You can't just not be public education. You got to do something differently. And this is what I would say. Now, this is where the homeschooling piece really does make sense, because the reason that schools have done what they've done is because
Before we go into the homeschooling thing, 1 second, because I think you're making a lot of good points there I want to touch upon before we go into that, because that's exactly where I want to go next. My daughter, when in the beginning, we put her in an alternative school. And a lot of people have identified some of the stuff you're talking about. They just don't know how to apply a lot of them. So what ended up happening in Toronto and many places out, even here when we got to Mexico, we found one of the schools I'm about to describe. They call themselves our alternative schools, but basically what they're doing is just hating on everything you just described. So what they end up doing is that they create this curriculum like the Montessori style, where all of a sudden they identify all those types of kids you're talking about, and then they just let them go off and do their own self-education, which also doesn't work. It seems like we went from one extreme of this barbaric factory style education system of depriving people of their natural born talents and their God-given abilities, to strip all of that away, as you did a great job describing. And then they go to the other extreme where all of a sudden it's very sort of woo-woo. It turns into this wokey sort of thing where all of the they'll just learn on their own. They know exactly what they're doing, and just let them be. He just wants to eat grass. Let him eat grass. And literally when I took my daughter to the school, that's kind of how it was. And then there wasn't any structure at all. So they went from one extreme all the way to this other extreme. And then what I'm finding with a lot of homeschooling, and I love the idea and concepts of homeschooling. It's not that I'm shitting on it. I'm not doing that at all. Sorry, excuse my language. I'm not pooing on it. All I'm saying is that there has to be some sort of way of walking a fine line where you can encourage children and adults, because I find good teachers learn from good students, and it's they also learn at the same time. The teacher has to be a teacher and be a student at the same time. And I think that's a well played out system that I don't see in front of me as of yet, but I'm seeing the beginnings of, and I'm seeing a lot of the Orthodox homeschooling systems trying to adopt this. So let's start moving in that direction. What are some of the warnings that you would give people in terms of homeschooling, so that they don't just crap on the old system and then create some sort of woo-woo new system where there's some sort of well balance? I would say, how would you approach this?
That's a really good question. I think some of the warnings would be like I just said, don't do it from a reactionary position, because then you're just going to pendulum swing yourself back and forth, and then nothing ever is actually gonna happen. Because if you are doing a pendulum swing and you're just doing the things not that the public schools are doing, then you're still doing it from a basis of the same questions and the same assumptions. You're still coming in agreement with them, just from the opposite side, right? So don't be reactionary. One thing that's been kind of big in the last 20, 30 years is the unschooling movement, which is kind of like you say, where there's like no structure, no anything like that. And I've seen lots of people that have done that, and it really hasn't, I've never seen it done really that well.
Doesn't work.
By well, I mean that the person is actually ready for like living, like has the basic skills for living. At least public school teaches you how to read and do basic math and how to write somewhat. But there has to be something. Think of it like this. So I'll speak specifically to the Orthodox homeschooler, right? Some of the healthiest stuff that I've learned and experienced as of late within the Orthodox Church is hierarchy and structure.
Yep.
Hierarchy and structure, right? If you go to the liturgy, there's a definite structure behind it. I find so much peace in that, especially coming out of kind of a Pentecostal adulthood, that it's like very little form, almost unpredictability. Like to have that structure, I find so much peace in that.
Yep.
And knowing that you're doing the same thing, it's teaching modes of self-discipline too. I get up at 7, I make breakfast, and then I clean my own dishes, and then I get with mom about what I'm going to read for the day or whatever. There's a structure. So there does need to be some kind of a structure to it. And in terms of hierarchy, think about what the hierarchy within Orthodoxy is too. Like, why do they have the levels that they have? Everybody works. There's distinction within uniformity, right? The whole purpose is that the church would function like the church should be, to be Christ's body, that it heals the people who come to it, right? Yep. That's the purpose of it. It's intended to be so healthy, right? It's redemptive. It's life-giving. That's why you have that hierarchy. I mean, of course you have it because that's what Christ taught, and that's also what you see in the earliest church. I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but the whole thing about like why there's a hierarchy from a utilitarian view, at least, which is the flattest view, it's healthy, right? So for Orthodox homeschool families, and this is just from my own, I've not done this. I didn't approach it like this when I homeschooled our kids. But I did put some structure within it. I did set expectations. So what I would, and then there was some kind of hierarchy, although it was relatively loose at that time. So what would work the best? I think, from what I've seen that doesn't work and what I've tried that works, what I've done from within homeschooling and within public schooling, I would first ask yourself, what as a homeschool parent, what gifts and skills has God gifted this kid with? And these kids, whether you have one kid or you have 12 kids, what has God gifted this kid with? And you may not know yet. Well, how are you going to know? Give them exploration opportunities. Send them to the garden. Take them outside. Sit them at a piano. Show them how to play the piano. Like, it doesn't matter. Yep. That whole first time is intended to be a time of exploration, right? So just give them opportunities for exploration. Well, that forces some kind of a structure, right? Mm-hmm. So, I mean, there's free play is great, but also the time that dad sits down or mom sits down or grandma or whomever sits down and says, okay, this is how we're going to plant broccoli. Yes. And then they go and do that thing. And then by the end of it, fast forward 3 months and they've got broccoli and they're going to eat it, right? They're part of it. Mm-hmm. And it fits with how God made them. And the last thing I'll say about hierarchy is bring in people within that are within your community, like play to your strengths. Mm-hmm. There are lots of homeschool groups that have co-ops and such, which are really, really great. But it can't just be the same thing, like drop your kids off, come back a few hours. It has to be, okay, if God has made this kid and these specific ways, what opportunities am I going to give them? I'm not really great at this thing, so I'm going to have this community member they're helping out. So, that's kind of where the hierarchy goes in. So I hope that makes some kind of sense.
It makes more than sense. It's beautiful. I really love it. That's why I was smiling ear to ear. You said everything you eloquently. You bang on. You have a way with words. It's great. I love this.
I was just rattling.
No, you're really not. You're really, really not. I know how you feel because sometimes I ramble too, and then I look back and I'm like, oh, that made more sense than I thought. No, absolutely. You were not rambling. You nailed it. A lot of the comments in the chat are definitely backing up my statement that you're nailing it. We're getting close to the end, but we're not ending, but we're getting close to the end. So if anybody out there has any questions for Joseph or myself, please throw them in the chat and we'll do our best to answer them. I keep forgetting this is live. I've never done a live interview before, and I really enjoy it. It's great. So thanks, Joseph, for my very first live interview.
Yeah.
I also wanted to before we go anywhere else, before I forget, I wanted to say something. I like doing things transparent. I like doing things live, as you've probably noticed from watching my shows. I want to offer you something. I want to tell you that I'd like to, because we've talked off air about podcasting, you possibly doing something, this and that. Us helping you out or this and that, being part of the network, this and that. After having interviewed you, I think you should definitely do it. I'm going to encourage you to do it. And not only am I going to encourage you to do it, I'm going to insist that you do it. So when we get off and we move forward, you definitely should do this. I definitely want to offer you an opportunity soon, very soon, doing your own little segment on our network. So we'll talk about that offline, and I'm doing it publicly, so you can't say no. Not that you would, but they can't say no, and that people can look forward to it down the road. This was great. You should be doing a lot of this. I think this is something you should even focus on. It's something that we're going to be doing ongoing. I think that this is imperative. It's a must. So I'm just putting it out there. I'm putting you on the spot. So it's almost like you don't even have a choice. So I'm just letting you know that I think we should talk about this offline.
Yeah, let's do it.
To do something. Okay, great, fantastic. So in any closing words before you do, I want to play the video that you sent me that you wanted me to play. You said in the beginning to start with it, and I thought, no, I'm going to wait to the end. You know why? Because I had a feeling that you were going to gear this conversation so that this would be one of the best things to end with, because I knew you'd exemplify everything that Father Josiah Trenum says in this. So I'm going to play it real quick.
Yeah, play it.
And then I want you to end off with anything, any final statements or anything you want to make before you start plugging yourself.
Yeah.
Christians to get out of the public school system 100%. Amen. Why do we put our children into the public school systems and tolerate a lack of school choice in our country when the Bible and prayer is banned from our system? That is deeply immoral. I don't want any of our young people growing up thinking that they're getting education without any communion with God and any scripture. It's nuts.
I just want to say one thing about that before you go off. I remember the very day they banned Our Father in the mornings as a prayer. I went to public school in Toronto, and from most of my, I think it was grade 6, they stopped doing Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. The only reason I know it off by heart so well is because I started every morning with the Canadian national anthem, and then, which by the way they've changed now, they've made it more woke, and then we'd go from that and we'd say Our Father before starting any class. I remember that.
This was a public school?
This was a public school in Toronto, Canada. They still did Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy. I'm old. 89, 90, 89. I believe
we weren't even doing that in the U.S. I went to public school, the one I graduated from in 1992 in Florida. Mm-hmm. I don't remember any of that.
Canadian school system was different. Canada was a good place. It was a great place. And it started to decline in the 90s, but up until about 89, it was a great place. And we had, it was a public school, and we talked about God. God wasn't banned, everyone can talk about their faith and their religion. No one was, but we did Our Father in every morning. And it was good, other than some of the stuff that we were discussing now, because it was the beginning of it in Canada. It was the beginning of giving kids, telling them that they're ADHD and all that stuff. And that's what they were trying to tell my dad, that they had to medicate me. But my dad was like, is awesome. And he says, absolutely no way. Don't even touch my child. And they put me through the ringer a bit in some bizarre ways, more so than other kids. Now that I think back to it, I had very strange experiences in school. Some of them were like, that was so weird. Maybe that's a whole thing for another podcast. But But my experience in school was very strange. But I do recall when they took God out of it and they banned God. Like I remember we couldn't even talk Christian God. You couldn't talk Christian God. And they even worded it that way. You can't speak of God in a Christian way, but you could talk about it in any other way. So
Yeah.
I don't know. I just went off because he got me going there, Father Josiah Trenum. So anyways, final words. If you have any final thoughts.
There still is Pledge of Allegiance in American schools.
Okay. How does that differ? Is it a
lot of people don't know this.
Yeah.
Kids never said the Pledge of Allegiance in American schools until the 1950s. I believe it was, I want to say it was 1953 or thereabouts under Eisenhower, and it was essentially a communist litmus test. They started to do that. They enacted that federal because now the federal had the agency to say that everyone must do X, Y, or Z. And so then, because this was like at the tail end of the Korean War, we were afraid of communism. We could see what Mao was doing, the Red Scare, all of that. And I want to say it was 53, but it was thereabouts. It was in the 50s under Eisenhower that they started to do the pledge. And it was specifically because the belief was if you could say one nation under God, then you were not communist. If you could say that. So it was like it was like Salem all over again, you know? Yeah. So we can stand and give that Pledge of Allegiance to a flag, but not have those other engagements like the Father was saying, which to me is a little bit bizarre if you look at the whole history of the thing. But there's two things I want to say because I know that we've run kind of long here.
No, it's fine. Keep going.
One of the things is that I completely agree with him in his thesis that Christians should take their kids out of public school. But that's also the ideal. It's really, really difficult for single moms or single dads. Yes. I was a single dad for a few years. Mm-hmm. Really, really, really difficult for some people. Not everyone has the life that will avail to be able to do that. If you can do it, 100%. If you can homeschool your kids, 100%, without a doubt. However, it's really difficult to do it for some people, right? Because they couldn't simply take them out and afford to put them in school. I mean, some of them are whether it's even low income. I had lots of students who were raised by their grandmother. Mm-hmm. So that works for a good, healthy family. But people that are already struggling, they're just going to struggle more. Another thing that there's a whole thing. This is probably something that most people, even in this chat, will disagree with. But when you look at the First Amendment, you look at the whole issue of freedom of religion, and then you look at the framers of the Constitution. If we ask ourselves, like, is America a Christian country? This is not the part that most people would disagree with, but it is not.
No,
right?
It wasn't built that way.
Who wrote the Declaration and who was the chief author of the Constitution itself? Well, Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson, you can go to Monticello today and open up Thomas Jefferson's Bible, and he took a knife and he carved out anything that had to do with the divinity of God, of Christ. Well, you take away the divinity of Christ, you've taken away the whole thing. Right. So there's nothing. So the chief architect of this document didn't even believe in the divinity of Christ. How can you say then that this country is a Christian country? Look at the behaviors that happen. As if this country were a person, nobody would say that's a Christian person.
Yes, true.
Right.
That's true.
So on that basis, we have the First Amendment, and within what the framers said, they talked about how freedom of religion is not freedom from religion, even in the public sphere. It's freedom from religious preference by the government. So the government couldn't say we are Christian or we are Muslim or we are Orthodox or we are Catholic or whatever. The government just has to give freedom for religion to happen. Yeah. So this is the part that probably will piss a lot of people off, and I think that Father Josiah would probably disagree with this as well. But the unfortunate thing is, because we are not a Christian society, we're a secular state, we're a constitutional republic, apparently, or at least we have the veneer of it. If you were to actually do what the First Amendment said, you would have to give time for Muslim kids to pray 5 times a day or whatever. It'd be 2 times a day within that window of time, because the government can't give preference to one. If you give preference to Christianity, you can't give, then you have to give equal airtime to all of the others. And then that opens it up to now, well, how do we define religion, right? There was a kid who came up with a religion called the religion, the flying spaghetti monster. And he went online and did this kind of thing. And then like he made every school day a holiday so he could be religiously exempt from ever going to school, right?
Yeah.
So it opens up a whole nother can of worms. So it's like either all or nothing, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you don't want to hear the call to prayer from the speaker at your public school, you kind of really have to play the game across the board. And that's the unfortunate thing, which is where he would probably say, we've got to take our kids out of school. And to that, I would agree. Mm-hmm. But you really got to parse out what that actually means. You know, when you're dealing with those constitutional amendments in America, people like to rattle off First, Second, 10th Amendment, but there's so much nuance and context that you have to look at. And so we couldn't really have, you know, Bible study prayer like he says. Now, I will say that he's not completely correct in that there is prayer, there is Bible study on campuses, but it has to be done at a particular time and place. So in America, at least, we have what's called Title IX, and that's a law that says that basically because the public school facility is publicly funded, that kids should be able to select groups and do things before school or after school or in designated places if they have like an adult who is present but not leading it. So Fellowship of Christian Athletes, for example, they can meet at school, they can pray. I mean, they're at my school I most recently taught at, there were Bible studies left and right, girls' Bible study, guys' Bible study, and they did those things. And I can tell you at my school, we got together as a staff and prayed for our students.
Wow.
At my high school. And this is most recently. And they would call out on the announcements long before like the school start, like when we do work days before the beginning of the school year. If anyone wants to, you can come to such and such room at such and such time and we'll pray. And I tell you, probably 90% of the staff were in there. Really? And we would pray for kids. Yeah. Wow. Which leads me to the final point that I want to make. Mm-hmm. But as far as the whole thing about, you know, the like prayer at school, it has to be at a certain time. You can go to the pole and pray until 8 o'clock or until 7:59, but when the bell rings at 8 and the school day officially begins, you can no longer do that. So it's okay at 7:59, but not okay at 8:01 because it's outside of the frame of that time. Does that make sense?
It does.
So there's a kind of a nuance. You have to look at the specific thing. So you could have kids who are like the group of Satan worship kids. Mm-hmm. Well, they could go to the principal and say, we want to meet. And as long as the things that they're doing don't contradict the laws or the rules of the school, they can do those things. But they'd have to have a teacher to be able to be present for them during that time. You can have Bible studies, you can have all that stuff. So it largely is driven by the students. And the body of students are the ones who will bring it up and say, hey, can we meet? Can we do that? At my most recent school, there's more Bible studies than there were other types of groups. Mm-hmm. So I got one last final thing to say about it, which is I want to really caution everybody to the way that you speak about educators, public educators, and the way that you approach them, even the way that you view them. Because I can tell you as somebody, those who have been through this have heard my story. Like I went into education because I believe that God called me there. And I did it for 18 years because I felt like he did. And then at the point where I felt like he said, it's time to do something new, then I left. Mm-hmm. But I was there shaking kids' hands, praying over my room every day, praying for the kids at length a lot of times. And there are so many more teachers than you would think that are doing those things. So as a teacher, first of all, you're paid like trash. You're treated like trash by a lot of kids. Not everyone is able to navigate it as well as I did. But the thing I would really caution you about is the rhetoric that you speak about, to speak to or about them.
Yep.
Well, there's all these problems. But when you get to the classroom level and you're talking about the kid who's there looking at your student or the kids in your community, feeding into them, not all of them are trying to put condoms on bananas and get them to, to go and do pronoun things. And not all of them are trying to force them to, have an altar call, Right. I was chumming the waters for everybody. I got so sick of the culture wars and the left and the right. You're drawn and quartered between the left and the right. And I was just there trying to do my damn job.
Yes.
I was there trying to give life to kids, to teach them how to read, to teach them how to speak, to teach them how to be humans and to be a man in the life kids who most of them didn't have that. And so the left was always saying like, oh, look at all these, Bible thumping teachers trying to do this. And then it was much worse on the right. I heard it much worse on the right. Oh, look at all these public educators. They're trying to teach them to put condoms on bananas, and they're trying to get them to believe that evolution and all this stuff. How many and this is those who have been in Protestant churches. How many times have you heard your pastor rail against public education and public educators? Before I became Orthodox, I heard that so many times. I look around like, well, I can see 12 people right now that are public educators. What are they thinking right now? Because he basically just crapped on us from the pulpit. So, and not necessarily saying like, hey, you guys are doing a work. Let's do something.
That's why earlier I made that comment about even online orthodoxy. I'm starting to see this kind of garbage happening online, and then everyone's kind of fighting. And like I'm even getting it private. Like I'm getting private messages from certain people. Very surprising sometimes. And none of my friends. So again, I'm saying this, if anyone of my friends thinks, I'm not talking about you, I'm talking about just like strangers, whatever. And they're trying to do the same thing. And I'm like, listen, we're creating these little camps within the Orthodox community. And then like, can you imagine being a Protestant trying to walk into that, or like a Catholic and you're like ortho curious, and then you're just getting slammed with like, it's gotta be like this, it's gotta be like that. And like there's this particular priest who's doing really great work. I almost want to mention his name, but I don't know if I could or should. And he's doing great work. He's an Orthodox priest. He's doing amazing work on the ground level, like literally walking up to homeless people that are in like the worst shape possible, and literally getting involved in their lives and trying to like live on the streets with them for a little bit to kind of bring hope into their lives. And this person is being criticized by other Orthodox people, and because he's not doing it in an Orthodox way, like the way he doesn't look like, I don't want to say too many specifics because people know kind of who I'm talking about, but he's not doing things specifically in this. I'm like, can you get any more Christian than that?
Yeah.
Like, can you get any more Christian than that? And then someone, like what you described about like the left and the right, and then, going to Protestant churches and they're attacking the teachers from the pulpit. This is a dangerous thing we're doing here. We're like making enemies of the people that we should be making friends with, and having open dialogue and open conversation. And I'm kind of getting really sick of it. That's why I'm fired up right now. So my apologies. I'm not trying to derail what you're saying. I feel what you're saying, and I'm feeling it on my end. And I think we have a responsibility for anyone that's standing in front of a camera to talk into this stupid machine. Like, it's a stupid machine, but my point isn't to sit here and entertain people only or whatever, or even myself. Like, I'm trying to learn. And I have my guests on my podcast to learn. And then at the same time, I'm hearing people in the Orthodox community creating these inner battles and arguments. And it's exactly what you just described about the Protestant teachers getting attacked from the right, getting attacked from the left. And how do you know that person on the left isn't interested in what you're saying? They may very well be interested in hearing about the gospel, or maybe interested in finding out about orthodoxy or whatever, or they want to start at Protestantism because it's easier, and then they want to work their way to orthodoxy. Isn't that what we should be doing? And I went off on a rant because what you just said, hit a button, because I'm getting all these weird messages and I don't like it. And that's why I'm trying to create this conversation. And I'm trying to get, put music out there. I'm getting even attacked for playing some Protestant stuff. The you know what I mean? And I'm not promoting Protestantism. I don't think that's what we were doing at all. We were calling it
It was kind of the opposite.
Prattle. You know what I mean? And it's like, and I'm not doing that. That's not what I'm trying to do here.
Yeah.
And I'm a little annoyed. And I think the conversation the way you just took that, it just hit a button. I apologize, everybody. I'm Orthodox. I'm pre-denominational. I like to look at it that way. I'm pre-denominational. I'm only interested in what's true. I'm not interested in all the other in-between stuff. I think that's what you're interested in. And I think that's what a lot of the people out there that are tuning into what we're trying to do here are. And it's not a promotion of the network or anything. I'm just sick of it, man. Sick of it. Sorry.
Well, it reminds me of the video that you showed on Sunday's SOS. It was, what's the priest? He's kind of got like red hair, white beard.
Oh, Father Lynch, Zachariah Lynch, Father Zachariah Lynch.
Yeah, he's talking about the priesthood. They asked him, he's like, this is the worst career you could have.
Yes.
If it's a career.
Yes.
I think that's people quickly, and again, as a as a kid of a Baptist pastor, we caught the shrapnel for those kind of things within Protestantism, and I fear that Orthodoxy it could go the same way. Satan's thumbprint can't be more obvious than division, separation, and squabbling over stupid shit that nobody really cares about. It doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is Christ, right? All the other stuff, it's like, it doesn't matter. So that priest was talking about how difficult the priesthood is and how you bear so much and you carry so much. And in a similar but different way, you see the same thing with teachers, I think, as well. And completely like a different set of stressors. There's a lot of distinctions for sure, but just like you don't know how much stress that priest is under. So shut your mouth. Don't criticize. Criticize yourself. Repent of all of it. And then support that priest the best that you can. Same thing with teachers. People come at them all the time. So what I would say is, in terms of education, support or criticize the institution, but support the people.
Yes. Amen. I would agree with that. I think that's a great way to end it. I always said a gun can help protect your family, feed your family, or kill people. A good teacher, the same thing. A good teacher is an asset. It's something that we should strive to create many of in our societies. And a bad teacher can destroy a child forever. And it's great to have you on here, brother. You are most definitely a great teacher. I think you still are a teacher. You're not an ex-educator. I think you should continue on this path. And I think that's something that we're going to talk about developing as a podcast or whatever direction you want to take it. But what you've said needs to be heard from many, many people. So, brother, before you go, please, anything you need to plug, do it. We'll also put everything that you plug in the show notes and all that. We love to support our family. So go ahead, family.
Well, I do intend to pretty soon work with you on podcasting. So I accept your invitation or your demand, rather. I accept, but presently my life is not education. Presently my life is coffee. So when we broke away, I became a coffee roaster. My family and I, we started Beard Brothers Coffee Company in Maryville, Tennessee. Presently, the best thing to plug, I guess, would be people go check that out. The website right now is mostly informational, but within 30 to 60 days, it should be up where you can purchase some of the coffee. So presently, I'm the sole roaster, so I think it's pretty darn good. And we direct trade so that the monies go back directly to the farmers and their communities. So there's a lot of stuff on our Instagram, Beard Brothers Coffee Company Instagram, as well as our Facebook page that gives a lot more information about what we do and why we do it. So we're trying to do a good work there in a whole different shift of gears. So as far as myself, what I'll be doing, we'll be still talking and stuff. So I'm sure that I'll put that up. And once I get going in terms of podcasting and content creation, because I have a whole new thing that I want to do that is going to be freaking awesome. So I'll release that when it gets closer to it. But presently, the best thing you could do is check out Beard Brothers Coffee. Come back in a month or so and buy some coffee online. Yeah.
Awesome. Brother, thank you. God bless you and your family. Thanks for doing this, my friend. I'm sure this is not the last.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. It was great. I really appreciate it.